Yeah, I wanted to start by kind of setting the stage. So for who we're going to talk to and what specifically we're going to talk about. So I am going to share my screen briefly to kind of set that stage, and then we'll come back and we'll talk directly to our panel of photographers. Um, so this is the exhibition we'll be talking about. I don't presume everyone's seen it, so maybe some of you have, but if not, I kind of wanted to just give some context for the artwork we'll talk about that you'll see. And so this is the exhibition, Land Is, Parks, Culture, Stories, with Ramona Dallum Lindsey and friends. And those friends and photographers that we have are tonight, Nubia Bennet, Jonathan P. Cherry, who I don't know if he can join us this evening. I believe, unless he's on here, you could say present. If not, I believe he is ill. But we're also joined by Joshua, Jean-Marie, Abdul Sharif, and T.A. Yero. And the work that we're talking about specifically tonight is this work, Land Is Parks. And this is the central work in the exhibition that Ramona has put together. And it is, essentially what I wanted to set up first is Ramona's practice as a textile artist, I think, is important here. Because many of the things that she introduced and brought into this exhibition, she's been thinking about for a long time, and kind of given the prompts to these photographers to help, sort of fill out some of her intentions. And this is sort of just example for scale and the room that this work is set in. And then at the bottom is, again, Ramona bringing her textile. So this is a border that she created to frame this quilt, this sort of photography, sort of visual quilt that she created based on our photographers who are with us. And one of the things Ramona's been doing for quite some time is thinking about public space, thinking about parks. And so I wanted to kind of share this work, which is also in a show from 2011, about 10 years from now, but to kind of create a sort of platform, if you will, for, I think, what she was responding to and wanting to expand on for this exhibition. And so I wanted to kind of just ask Ramona, talk a little bit about your textile practice and what made you think of photography to then, create this kind of central work that involves their images.
Well, thank you, Joey, and thank you to KMAC for giving us all the space to share our ideas and creativity. Land Is Parks, Culture, Story. For me, as an individual, land and access to land has always been very important to me, especially in neighborhoods that have been historically underinvested in and under-resourced. And as an African American woman, the African American quilting tradition of taking those things that others have seen discarded or no longer have value or use, taking those items and stitching them together and giving them new life, new purpose, new meaning is something that I like to do in my practice. So I always use repurposed fabrics and materials in my work. But as I'm looking at those fabrics, I notice that the images are in many cases, a reflection of what's around us. And this past summer during COVID, when I was walking through the parks to get out of the house and away from the monotony of being stuck in one place, I started walking in different parks throughout the city. And I'd gone to Iroquois Park one day and they had the barricades up, but people were freely walking and you could tell that the barricades were there to keep cars from coming in so people could walk on the streets. Then I went down to Shawnee Park the same week and there were police cars blocking the entrance to the parks with police officers sitting in the cars, and it was a very different feeling. I could still go into the Shawnee Park, but it was different being blocked by a police car with a human in it. And that human was in full uniform. So I had the impression that he was probably armed. So I wasn't sure if I should go into the park or not. I wasn't sure why he was there, but he didn't stop me. He didn't say anything to me. So I walked by him and went on into the park and did my walk. And it made me to start thinking about how land and access to land is treated differently in different parts of our city. And I began to wonder if what I saw in Shawnee Park and Iroquois Park was that unique, or was that a real reality? And began to think about how can I capture this. And the five photographers that I invited into this process, when I looked at their work, they all seemed to have a style that kind of seemed a little voyeuristic. It looked like in a lot of their images that they were capturing people in their space, but that person possibly didn't realize that that photographer was watching them. And I wanted to see what would happen with artists who had that particular style, went into the parks just to see what they could see, and then use those images as a sort of a textile to tell a narrative. And I intentionally laid those photographs out in a square, just like a traditional quilt would be laid out in squares. And I tried to play with the colors and the images to help shape that story. So, and the fabrics around it represent the people who probably would have been in some of those parks, because our textiles represent our cultures and the thing that we believe. So that was the reason for bringing these photographers in, to get some different perspectives, and then to help tell a story that when people look at these images, that hopefully they start to question how we as society are providing access to in public spaces, and what we can do to make sure that access is more equitable.
Thank you. Yeah, and I wanted to, kind of agree with you. I think many of us recognize the momentous year we've had, not just in the world, but certainly in this city. And parks, for me, became one of the first things we noticed, perhaps because maybe you started to frequent them more, or maybe you started to just notice that was like the one place you could go, or whatever it was. I think a lot of our thoughts, a lot of our experiences began to sort of become focused, certainly on, if not parks, public spaces, within Louisville particularly, and how those are meted out, how they're met with the demographics and the people who experience them. And so the photographers, another thing I noticed also, Ramona, in terms of comparisons, is that all of the photographers both have self-proclaimed kind of experiences as photojournalists, as fine art photographers, landscape, cityscape photographers, portraitures, still life. I mean, they all, you did a very, I think, nice job of picking five photographers who also kind of overlap a lot of these styles and genres. And all of that, I think, comes through in the images that they provided and that they took and supplied. So I guess, to get to some of the photographers, maybe we could call on them randomly, but maybe I'll just pick Nubia first for alphabetical reasons, perhaps. But, and also I know that your experience, I know some of the photographers maybe experienced things a little differently and their approach was different, but I know your approach, Nubia, was very similar to, I think, Ramona's kind of mindset, was looking at inequities and disparities in the demographics of the neighborhoods that you were photographing in. I don't know if you wanted to speak to your experience doing this, what you learned, or how you responded to the assignment.
Oh, yes, definitely. So, as I said in the video that we did for the opening of the exhibit, I was raised by a historian, a sociologist, and a photographer, like all three, an artist. Well, and there's all kinds of both in my family. So you can imagine our dinner table conversations. I think I mentioned that in the video as well. But as I was given the parks, we were assigned different parks. I shot Iroquois Park. I shot Leland Taylor Park, which is a small park in the West End in Portland, and Petersburg Park, which ironically was close to the middle school I went to. And then I can't think of the fourth park I shot off the top of my mind. Oh, Shelby Park, I'm sorry, which is actually in my neighborhood. I live in the Shelby Park neighborhood. And one of the things that was really shocking for me was very similar to what Ramona said. I got a very international feel at Iroquois Park because it was open to most people. I think at the time I was shooting it, there was also the pumpkin festival and everything. So to speak to the voyeuristic part of just our styles, our combined styles, there were so many things to shoot there. But when I went to the other parks, where that's just not as available, like the things to do just weren't as available and as plentiful, it was very much more personal. And I even had to go up to people and told them to act as if I'm not shooting. And it was a little more staged because there were fewer people to choose from because there were fewer options. So, and even in some of my shots at Shelby Park, for example, which has a very interesting dynamic between who comes to those parks, considering gentrification and everything and land use, right? I had a very different feeling because there were families there sometime on some of the days I went, but then there were also a couple of shots that I took that I sent to Ramona that had, just showing the realistic view of what happens when people don't have access to the services they need, whether that is drug paraphernalia, more litter, all of those kinds of things. It was very clear. I didn't have to pick what I wanted to shoot. It kind of came to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So next, I kind of playing off of that, you mentioned the video that we made earlier, and Joshua, in that video, you kind of mentioned not necessarily wanting to play to a narrative, but in fact, you mentioned kind of wanting to approach these spaces in a more maybe simple way, and so I wanted to maybe have you address your approach and your thoughts to both the assignment and maybe to your practice about why you made the decisions you made.
Yeah, for sure. When I was first approached about the project, I think it was honestly a little bit outside of my comfort zone. I spent a lot of my time doing portraiture and shooting people. And being presented with a project on land, I had to pause and think of, okay, how do I want to approach this? And for me, a lot of my work centers around themes of intimacy and storytelling. And I brought that same approach in for this project. And for me, I didn't want to necessarily incorporate humans as much unless they were part of the land or the existing space. So the image at Dave Armstrong Park, that's a perfect example of someone kind of existing in the space already. But with Shawnee, that park wasn't as populated during the time that I went, but I still found a place to almost incorporate, if humans were here, where would they be sitting or where would they be participating or partaking within the park? So that's kind of my main approach of how I approached this project, and intertwined how I usually work with the project that was presented. Yeah.
And so next, I'm just going to kind of go through here, and I know, and Abdul, I noticed in some of your images, I wasn't sure. I kind of picked some of these at random to sort of talk about in terms of what you did for this assignment. But I know that, you really do come from a kind of fine art background. And so I'd be interested to hear sort of your perspective on how you also thought about this assignment, if there was a comfort level, or if in sort of a photojournalistic kind of way, you were able to find an editorial in here somehow.
Okay, can you all hear me okay? All right, so the parks that I had were really empty when I went. So I'm used to photographing abandoned buildings and kind of documenting some of the empty spaces we have around the city. So I really tried to approach it from a standpoint of as if someone had never seen these places before. I do a lot of architecture photography, so I tried to compose the images in a way that were kind of showed off the beauty as well as the mundane, like the everyday life. Some of the signs that were in the park that were kind of worn out. And the park that I really had the most fun photographing was California Park. It's next to an elementary school where I went to school growing up, next to Wheatley Elementary in the California neighborhood. So when I went to the park, it was empty. Nobody was there. You could see that the city had took down the basketball courts, or the basketball rims. So I wanted to kind of take pictures of some of the things that had changed because of the result of the pandemic, but also try to focus on some of the beauty of the park as well. So that was kind of my approach.
And TA or Yero, perhaps I know you maybe had a similar experience as Nubia, really kind of a stark sort of contrast in some of the parks that you visited and some of your reactions to how these spaces were maintained and the way people engage with them.
Yeah, so I am not from here. I am a transplant. So all of these parks I had to Google. I had to get directions to. I had no idea where Ben Washer. I didn't realize that Ben Washer was downtown. And for me, I'm thinking if it's downtown, then obviously, they're taking care of it. It's going to be the most pristine park ever. And of the parks that I was assigned, it kind of was the worst, which was really shocking. And it actually made me kind of sad because I'm from Houston, Texas. So parks are kind of big in in Houston. So it really made me sad to see the overgrown grass, like grass as high as the actual park bench. Homeless people like set up. They had shelves and things there because they were there all the time. And so that was Ben Washer. The swings were tied up, like you can tell that nobody was there. And then you go to Tyler Park and they're building a second playground for Tyler Park. There's tennis courts that were filled. There was, as you can see, there's a hippie, I don't know what you want to call him, but there's a guy that was there drinking his latte, reading a book. And so it was just like, wow, you can really tell the difference where the parks are being kept, where they're being maintained. And it actually, I sort of kind of, not gonna lie, I might have shed a tear when I was looking at all this stuff because it was really just surreal. There was another park that I went to, Sylviana, I have no idea what it's called, but it was another one that it looked abandoned. Like I had to actually make sure that I was there in the right place because there was no signage. The community center was boarded up and had all kinds of graffiti on it. Some of it was very obscene. And the tennis court that was there was overgrown with weeds. So like you can tell how long it's been if the weeds are growing up through the concrete. Like it was really just eye-opening. And I wanted to thank Ramona. I think I sent her a text message. I was like, this is completely eye-opening. I had no idea. Thank you so much for having me on here because I mean, yes, with my photography, I pretty much do everything, right? I do product, I do food, I do portraits, I do all that other stuff. But I had never really taken the time to just see the surroundings around me. And so it was very much eye-opening, and I love me a good black and white photo. So thank you so much for making us do the black and white, because it just made it more, it focused on the actual things that we're shooting versus the, oh, it looks so pretty and da da da. So it brought focus to what we're trying to convey. And it was that this stuff is unfair. Like, it's really some parks didn't even have bathrooms, and so it was just a lot.
Was black and white photography for anyone a kind of departure? Is that something you've all worked in or prefer or like, or was it a comfortable space, or do you prefer color?
Oh, I can
Joy,
speak to that. Clearly I'm kind of colorful, just a little bit. But my photography, my sister pointed out, who's also an artist, she pointed out that my photography reminded her of what's his name? She gotta have it. What is that guy's name? The director, Spike Lee. That's his name. Because everything he does, he always turns all of his videography up, like the saturation all the way up. And so every photo, if you follow like my social media feed, anytime I take like photography, it's always in color. And so Ramona said, "Is it going to be a problem that all of this photography is going to be black and white?" Guess what? I still turned the saturation as high up as I could go, which actually was a different treatment for me because it brought out a different kind of color, even though it was black and white, which was interesting.
Excuse me, Joey, before the next person answers, I want you to know that John Cherry just arrived. So he is here with us. And John, I hope you're feeling better.
Yeah, okay.
Hey, thanks, Ramona.
Well, Jonathan, great to have you. And we kind of went through, I sort of asked everyone about, their experience with Ramona's assignment, if you will, and thought maybe you could kind of share with us a little bit about, your experience doing this project and what you learned, if it was sort of out of your wheelhouse or it was something that you had found comfort in doing.
Yeah, it was a really comfortable surrounding for me to shoot in this way, not just with this type of processing, which is a black and white, which I'm really comfortable with, and I can get into that a little bit later too about why I'm so comfortable with black and white. But just kind of going around and exploring and talking to people and taking environmental photos is, I do a lot of different types of photography, product stuff, photojournalism, portraiture, social photography, events, and things like that. But a lot of it is like wildlife and landscape photography, which is just walking around a place and figuring it out and trying to find a good frame from it. So showing up at some of these empty parks or seemingly empty parks and trying to figure out where the frames are was not something that I was necessarily foreign to, but it was interesting the different inferences that could be taken culturally from the locations and the signage and the access to each one of these parks. And I spoke to Ramona about it shortly after some of my findings, just like anecdotal findings of like noticing that like certain parks that have more signage, more restrictive signage, have no one there. For example, Emerson Park in that second photo, they have this beautiful community garden, Save Our Bees. There were some other photos I submitted as part of the project that also had some birds of prey, wildlife, things like that, very active wildlife. But there was not a single person there. But what was there were a bunch of different signs citing city statutes showing what was allowed there and what was not. And one of them was like no skateboarding, no open alcohol containers, no this, no that. And there was no one there. But when I went to other parks, and I went to, I went to Wyandotte, Elliott, and Story Avenue Park. All these other parks didn't have all of this signage posted, and they were full of people. And the people that were there might not have necessarily been doing, they might have been doing things on that sign at Emerson Park that weren't allowed. So for example, Wyandotte Park, you see the two people that are there playing, were they playing squash, something like that. There were a bunch of guys that were off to the side by the basketball court, probably about a quarter mile away, just hanging out and drinking. They agreed to have their photos taken as well. If you look at some of the ones of Elliott Park was I think the smallest other than Story Avenue Park that I went and documented, and it was packed with people, a bunch of old heads just sitting around on their motor scooters. They have like those assisted mobility wheelchairs, just sitting around drinking and having a good time. Loved having their photos taken. Loved seeing somebody come in and just check them out, somebody that they hadn't recognized, because I'm sure it's the same people who go there every day. But it's fascinating to see the usage of this public land based off of who's around and what they can get away with doing there. And that was probably the biggest take that I got from it. Was it's people in less or like more impoverished socioeconomic backgrounds use this land more than people who don't. And if there's no sign saying they can't do anything there, then they won't do it. They won't even go. And Story Avenue Park was just a strange one, because I'm not sure if you all know where that one is. I pass by it all the time, but I've never been to it. It's a very small park. It looks like a place where people often take lunch breaks or coffee breaks or something like that in the middle of their workday. But the road that runs by it, people are flying by at 50 mile an hour, and it's a one way. So by the time you even recognize that there's a park there, you've passed by it and you're on to your next thing, heading towards downtown. So I think that it also speaks to the power of one-way roads and how easily it can make the world pass by you. And this park was nice. It was peaceful. There were two people there. There was one woman who was on her phone. She was pacing around having a really intense conversation. Did not want to have her picture taken. She didn't say it, but I just kind of got that. We had that understanding. And then another fella in one of those assisted mobility scooters, just sitting in the shade, just hanging out, and that was it.
From, you brought up, people brought up signage and graffiti. I think, from a kind of aesthetic or artistic sort of point of view, the Dave Armstrong Park is a place where maybe you look to the graffiti in order, from a photographer's perspective, to capture the environment or the aesthetic of that park, where in other parks it's like maybe perhaps an unattractive thing or a sign of vandalism. Or I don't know if anybody thought, I don't know, Josh, if you have a thought on that, or anybody has a thought on, how they see graffiti. Is it something that they're interested in, or something that they see as a sign of people's treatment or thought or experience of that park? Or just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's interesting how there's certain areas that are where graffiti is almost like an accepted form of art, right? So you're talking about the skate park. You expect to go to a skate park and see graffiti. But I also think it speaks to this need within communities to have these spaces where this form of art can be openly expressed and not viewed in a way as like, oh man, something just got vandalized. Like, how can we, almost the question of how can we create more spaces where it's openly allowed for people to, have space to do graffiti. There's a large wall area in Atlanta, Georgia, and they almost allow artists to have these panels where they can come and do their own art, and it's this beautiful display when you step back and look at it. And you come to a place like Louisville and you have to ask, like, where is that? So you see places like, the Dave Armstrong skate park, and you almost crave and want to see it more. So I think it is interesting how we have these spaces where art like that is accepted, but you go to another park and it's viewed as vandalism or tearing up the park or taking away from the beauty of the park. So I did find that interesting and kind of photographing the different parks that I was in.
I don't know, Hunter, are there any questions that I'm not seeing? If not, we can continue, having a chat. I know, or if anybody else had any comments before we jump into a bigger conversation.
I've received no questions yet, so.
Okay, great. All right. Well, so
I do have a question or a comment, I guess.
Oh yeah, please.
So to Joshua, what you were saying about the panels in Atlanta, there's actually on I want to say it's First Street over by the JCC campus. There are actual panels. They have big concrete walls where they asked artists to come in and paint it. So there's different portraits of, like, there's love in sign language. There's an Afrofuturistic. I'm so bad with English. Girl there. There's Harriet Tubman. Like, there's different things there. Just as FYI for if anybody wants to go shoot that. But also, when it comes to graffiti, I will say that I guess graffiti is just a very general word for it. Because, like, if you go to the skate park, a lot of it might be graffiti, but then there's also messages there, and people have, like, that's their way to express things. And even when I was at that one park that I just really can't say the name of it, I'm really sorry about, Sylviana, whatever. You guys know what I'm talking about.
Pennsylvania.
Sylvain, there we go. That sounds way better than what I was trying to go for. But some of the graffiti, I guess, was artistic. Some of it was very vulgar. So I guess it just depends on the intent of it. I personally love taking pictures of graffiti. I love taking pictures of artwork just to see what, because they're artists. Well, some of them are artists and some of them are people with spray paint cans. So it's just from my point of view, from my eye, I sort of kind of see art everywhere. Like, I love to see, if you go to the grocery store, freshly stocked vegetables are like so amazing to take, because it's, especially if you go to a Target, there's like, it's all in a straight line and it's just so pretty. Or if you go to a soul food restaurant or a seafood restaurant, they have like Obey seasoning just stacked up in a line. So it really just depends on, I guess, what you see or what you can consider as art. But I guess that's always what they say, art is in the eye of the beholder. But from a photographer standpoint, I just love taking pictures of everything. Ice on a stop sign or something like that. It's just, it works with me. And I think, like you were saying before, black and white is another aspect of art, because then now you can see something that's truly beautiful in color, but then if you look at it from the point of, you're going to take it in black and white, it's a different, I guess, a different eye that you have to look at it to make sure that it has the right light in it so that it comes across correctly in black and white. Because there's levels to black and white. I don't think people understand. There's definitely levels to black and white. So that, I guess, that's one of the things that I love to do, is just take pictures of, I guess, abstract art, I guess, is that what you can call it that. But I just love taking pictures of just random things that people don't consider. Toothpaste, unrolled toothpaste, or this distribute toothpaste. Like, if you really think about it, the way that they have those stripes in it and the colors of it, like, that's art. I don't care what you say. So it's just, like I said, it just depends on the photographer and the artist. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I know we went from graffiti to toothpaste. Just don't mind me. I'm
No,
special.
you bring up a good point that if there's a way to expand on how, when you look through your lens and you go to take a picture, you're trying to find maybe art that's already existing in the world that you can capture. And I don't know, this project specifically maybe has this photojournalistic component to it, or social commentary, or sort of social change component to it, where you're reporting out things that you're seeing. And I'm not saying your photograph doesn't end up obviously resulting in an artwork, but it's just interesting to hear you kind of make that distinction between finding art that exists naturally to sort of focus on, as opposed to, with this project or maybe other projects, just sort of capturing a moment or capturing something that maybe in the moment you're not thinking is art. It's just, this needs to be documented. I don't know if any of you all have thoughts about that, or how you approach, your work.
Well, if I may weigh in on that too, it's really interesting to. Sorry, it's really interesting to imagine that we have, that we, just in capturing graffiti, for example, that we are capturing somebody else's work paired along with what we are observing in the world, that is then being pieced together by Ramona, and being, it's just, it ends up being like multiple layers of appreciation of visual art. all in one. So to imagine like coming up with a graffiti piece and putting it on the side of like a community center at one of these parks, and then going to KMAC and then seeing that your graffiti was then taken a photo of by somebody and then stitched together by somebody else, and now it's on display. It's pretty cool, but it also like, it makes me wonder, how do we give proper attribution to those graffiti artists as well? Like it's their, it's, yeah, because it's not, they don't always have their signature or their Instagram tag or what have you on whatever that is. So I think that's just interesting to me. But then also, like, as far as like black and white, one of the reasons I love shooting in black and white is you offer up the lack of a distraction that color sometimes offers. So color can be, can add to a photo. It can also distract from the main point of a photo. And I think that when photographer is shooting in black and white, sometimes messing around with editing styles can be productive, and then figuring out that, hey, this would make a good black and white image. But I challenge every photographer here that doesn't already do this, if you go out shooting with the intention of ignoring color, just only going for composition and going for tonal values of light, then it will substantially change how you compose images. If you know that they're going to be, if you know that color is not an option and is not an issue, and to just see everything at the way that light lays on it and just actually see the content of the image, will completely change the way that you shoot. It's something I've challenged myself to a lot in the past year, and it makes for just a completely different way, I think, of going out and tackling some of these documentary challenges.
Can I? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll toss this question out for the other photographers of, was it, Ramona asked us or told us ahead of time that the images would be in a square composition. Did you all find it challenging, or did you have to, while you were shooting, kind of frame up? I know for me, every time I took a shot, I'm like, is this going to make the crop? How am I going to frame this up? So I'm curious to know if that was kind of a challenge or surprise for you all.
I put the training wheels on for that one because I'm not used to shooting a square crop. I'm very 36 by 24, 35 millimeter, So you can, for my full frame camera, I can change the image sensor area to a square area. And so I just shot with a square sensor or square sensor area just to make it easy and compose that way. Because otherwise, I know I would have done this. I would have shot something thinking something was chilling in a third somewhere, and then came in and square cropped it and completely blown the entire composition.
Also, I wanted to respond to both John and your question about the framing, because the color piece, that blew me, because I mean, clearly color is my favorite. It's my favorite accessory, right? So walking out knowing that it wasn't going to be something that I was going to be using, like it was a whole mind thing for me, but it did make me much more intentional about who and what I was shooting, and less concerned about how the colors were going to line up, because that's usually where I go, because I shoot people's kids playing. That's usually what I'm doing. It's very voyeuristic, like you all mentioned at the beginning. But then in the square piece, I didn't think about it. I was like, I'm just going to shoot everything as much as possible, because when I was trying to follow all the rules at one time, it made me very, I was thinking about too many details, and there wasn't enough art for me. And it felt too photojournalistic, because when I was in high school, we did photojournalism. So it was like, I'm not reporting on something. I mean, I am, but I had to make the art central for me, because my nature is to report back. So I had to really like lean more into the art, and then make it art a second time, to like, it's almost like two separate processes, where I saw something and I was like, oh, I'm gonna take this home and use this. It was almost three, because it was in color, and then it wasn't, and then it was a square. So that was almost three different processes that happened to create whatever I sent to Ramona. And that was an emotional process for sure.
Joy, can I say something?
Of course.
I didn't realize I was I never thought that, you know, the square crop was a barrier. Because I'm not a photographer. I see, but I don't capture like you all do with the camera. So I didn't even think of that as a barrier. But when you all were talking about the black and white, for me, it created a texture, just like you get a weave in a cloth or whatever. And when I put those images together, I was thinking about how the lines and the colors were working together. And when Joshua was talking about how he was looking to create a feeling through how he was setting up his images, there is a section. I don't know if anyone ever looked at the pictures closely, but I organized them so they were telling a story. And the central is people. People are in the very center of that. And then there's a space where it's almost like people are in a meditative process. And most of those are Joshua's images, where people are just in the space, seeming like there's some sense of reflection there. So to me, it's really interesting to hear that process and how that actually played in with my process. It's how the collaborative piece of us bringing all of our parts together is very interesting to hear now that we're all talking about it.
We know that actually leads to a question that someone asked in the chat about how did the collaborative process, you know, maybe change your practice. And I'm curious to know if anybody works collaboratively. I mean, we kind of talked about this in the beginning about how you responded to Ramona's assignment, but are you open? I mean, is it something that you've done in the past that if not, you may be photojournalists, you maybe work on assignment, but just the idea of creating, to Ramona's point, making a creative decision that in the end, these will all be square, for example, or, I mean, were those parameters that in the end pushed you in a way that you're intrigued by or interested in, and kind of working with new parameters like that from an aesthetic standpoint, as opposed to content?
I don't want to take over or anything, but I had mentioned before that I come from a family of artists. Like there's like my dad's a photographer, my sister and my brother-in-law are both painting and mixed media artists. And it actually, I never really considered myself the artist because there were so many in my family. And it's not a competition, but it just feels that way. It's like, oh, there's so many people in my family who do art and or classically trained in art. And in one way, the photography side, my dad and my uncle, I've been shooting with them for years. So I just did what they told me. So it felt much more collaborative after this. And then with my sister, because she's a mixed media artist and does like all these other things, similar to Ramona in the sense that she's not necessarily a photographer, but she's an artist. It's opened up a lot of conversation around ways that we can collaborate that prior to this would have just been like, oh, that's cool. So I'm excited to collaborate with my own family as well as other people as well after this experience.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this has been said before too, but you know, the for me, joining in on this collaborative effort, even though we were all going off on our own and doing our own parts of this project, it was the communication that originally, you know, garnered the project. Whenever Ramona drew us all together, and we were going through the processing of like, well, why is this kind of important to us as individuals, and the Zoom meeting that happened before that, and then kind of deciding like who would take which parts, which I think we went with like a randomizer, or Ramona went with a randomizer and just kind of delved out the assignments. But for like me personally, this was a growing mechanism, because oftentimes I'm put in like a leadership position, and like as like chief photographer type position, and I have other photographers that I'm working with that I'm kind of giving art direction to, or if I'm on a commercial shoot, then I am the person leading the shoot and giving everyone else direction on how to best assist me. And so this was like one where Ramona is telling me what to do, and I have these parameters on what to follow. And I know, Ramona, you said, I think you mentioned that it was like a barrier for the square crop, but I felt the opposite. I felt like it was more of a it was just a guide. It was more of a guidance piece. than anything. And so yeah, that's what it was for me. It was like, oh, here I just follow. I'm a pawn, and which is nice. So.
And you know, Paul asked this question about who sort of completed the work, if that was collaborative. But Ramona, ultimately, this was you that stitched together the final quilt, right?
Yeah. And I stated earlier that in my process, I like to take reclaimed items, things that people have discarded that they no longer want. And I go through those things and figure out how I can piece them together to make something brand new. Well, I asked each of those other artists to send me the top 5 images from each park that they shot at. And then to me, that's like them saying, okay, this is what I'm giving you, you work with it. And so I went through those images and then decided which ones to me told a story and how did they play together in that story. Like, for example, TA sent a picture of a man sitting in a chair who was homeless in Tyler Park. And you could tell he was at a table with all of his stuff, all of his life's belongings by him. And then there was another picture of the hipster in Tyler Park with his book and his cup of coffee. And to me, that showed the 2 men doing the exact same thing, sitting and relaxing in a park. But you could tell from their environment that it was 2 totally different socioeconomic classes, 2 totally different lifestyles. There was a definite dichotomy between the 2. And I wanted to show that. I know that in many cultures, the hawk is a spiritual animal. And when a hawk is in your presence, that's a spiritual safe space. John took a picture of a hawk on top of a telephone pole. A telephone pole is so unnatural for a hawk, but that hawk was sitting there like it was like blessing that whole area. And I placed that hawk in, I think, the top left corner of the composition, because to me it was like the spirits were blessing this thing, this land and everything that's coming from it. So that's how I went through the pictures and started thinking about how do they go together? What stories do they tell together? When I look at it, what does it make me feel? What does it make me think? And then the borders around the images, I actually quilted words. And I don't know if anyone has seen the exhibit, but the words that are on the top and the bottom are orange. They represent hope, and they represent all the things that land is for people. And then on the opposite ends, all the words are in white, but they're encased, are covered by a white veil. And all of those words are words of white power, white oppression, the policies, the laws, the systems that keep people from achieving or experiencing those words that are in yellow around the border. And John brought that up in his images, and Abdul did too, where they captured the signs that had all of these policies and statutes that said if you did this in this park, you are going to get arrested. So that was an oppressive tool being used in that park. Even a sign on one of the doors at Cox's Park that said you could not use these bathrooms during the wintertime. And to me, I started thinking about why would you keep somebody out of a bathroom, period, in a park? And then I'd start thinking homeless people, the coldest time of the year is when they will want to take refuge in a bathroom. So I put a policy in place to keep people from using these bathrooms. But all of that is represented in the pictures and what these artists saw, and then what I saw through their images.
And the other detail of that is that on each photo, you did also add the mileage, the distance to, say, downtown, right?
Yes, the miles from Metro Hall since Metro Hall is the place where every decision was made regarding those parks, because every park there is a Louisville Metro park. And I saw that someone commented that Olmsted parks are better kept up because they have the Olmsted Conservancy, but Elliott Park is an Olmsted park. And it was one of those parks that John took pictures of that was not well kept. So why is it that at that Olmsted Park is uncared for? California Park is an Olmsted Park. Abdul showed the pictures of the tennis nets and the basketball courts, but Iroquois Park is an Olmsted Park too. So what's the difference? Is it because some Olmsted parks have friends groups who have deep pockets who can raise money to take care of them, but other Olmsted parks might not have those friends groups, so they are overlooked? It's a lot to think about and to consider when we're talking about land use, land access, and these public spaces that are supposed to be available and equitable for all of us.
Yeah, so to the point of like the Olmsted parks, I mean, I'm only assuming that, you know, there's like both the private fundraising that goes into the Olmsted Bank. I wonder, do you see some of these parks as really being within the neighborhoods, like, or the people that use those parks, almost like should create their own? I mean, not that that's our responsibility, but create their own sort of resources to help that park? If I don't know, I'm just sort of saying, is that some of the things that you think about?
That's one reason that Ben Washer is so essential to this exhibit, because Ben Washer Park is a park where a group of citizens said, we want to reclaim this park. And how can we do this? Ben Washer Park is a park where African Americans, Irish, and Jewish families have all used that park. That neighborhood has been essential for all three of those cultural groups. And there are members from all three of those cultural groups working together to reclaim Ben Washer Park through the work of Bridge Kids International. And so that's an example of what can happen when people decide for themselves. If the government's not going to do it, if the government's going to ignore us, then how can we as individuals take charge and reclaim these spaces? Just like in my art, I reclaim those discarded things that people throw away and give them new life. How can our advocacy and our leadership and our voices give new life to these places that we now don't have access to, or that aren't used in the way that is most beneficial for us?
So we're getting close to an hour. I might wrap up things soon. I want to make sure if there are any questions, people can sort of take the opportunity now. You know, otherwise, if the artists have, photographers, anyone has any thoughts that they haven't shared yet that they'd like to share? Before we get off here, I do want to say sort of thank you to the photographers. I mean, I'd like to say thank you to any artist that shows at KMAC. Obviously, I think they're all equally important, but I think that having you all involved in this, you know, from sort of my point of view, given that you do all have backgrounds, say, not only in fine art photography, but also photojournalism, we did have such a momentous year, and that seeing your work and what you bring to it and how you both represent our city, our place, where we are, is, I think, super important to me. So I'm very appreciative of this project and what you've brought to it. So I just wanted to share that. I mean, thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll throw in, if you haven't seen this project in person, if you're able to, and if that's something you can do, I encourage you to do so, because the size of the quilt, the size of the piece alone is breathtaking. And I think the coolest part, or one of the coolest parts for me, was, yes, we all had these individual park assignments, and we all had a collaborative goal, but we didn't know how the images were going to be laid out. We didn't know what this final product was going to look like. Honestly, when I heard that Ramona was making a quilt, I'm like, how are you doing this? And like, what's the size going to be? And when I finally got, the chance to go see it in person, my jaw just dropped because the size of it and the intentionality behind the words and just the whole process. So if you can go see this while it's exhibiting, I definitely encourage you to do so.
And a piece that you don't see is the stories that people are telling about their experiences in the quilt, our experiences in the park. So if you do have an opportunity to go see the exhibit, if you can just stay in the room for a moment and just absorb it and take your time to be with it, just like many of us like to take our times and just be in the park. I created the exhibit so people could just be in the space. And our intention was to have a park bench there. That didn't kind of work out, I don't think yet, but I wanted people to just be in the space and absorb it all. So I thank all of my artists, my photographer friends for joining me in this journey. It couldn't be possible without all of you and your vision, your eyes, and I thank you for trusting me to put it all together. And I thank anyone who goes see it, to partake in it. I thank you for allowing it to be a part of your life, because that's how our community is built and we grow, when we all allow ourselves to be ourselves in the spaces that we have. So thank you, Joey.
Yeah, thank you. Well, if that no more final thoughts, I'll just wish everybody safety during the weather, and stay warm and stay well and get well, Jonathan.